So traditionally, we do like an awkward intro. It's not intentional. It just happens. It's just how it goes. We don't have a way to start these, so we just kind of let it happen.
Hi, my name's Tyson Mao. I started the World Cube Association 20 years ago, which makes me really old in
Yeah.
in the cubing world.
Yeah, I
guess
was 2
Yeah.
then when you started it.
I must have met Cameron back. He must have been 12 or 13 back then.
Yeah.
He was a kid.
Yeah.
He's a lot taller now.
Yeah, a lot taller. Yeah. Yeah. Well, since we have you here, and you've told me off camera that you've been pretty much like out of it for the last like 10-ish years. Like you've kind of seen some things, but you haven't been like deeply involved.
Yeah. So WCA started. The WCA started basically January of 2004, right? Happy to talk about that, but by the time I got to 2013, so 2004, like 2005, like in 2005, I placed, I want to say 7th or 9th in the world championships
Wow.
for 3x3 speed solve. I'm not a fast speed solver. In 2005, I had the world record for blindfolded, right?
Really?
But yeah, that was a minute 58.
Well, still, I mean that's faster than I am now currently.
But by the time 2006, 2007 rolled around, I was irrelevant. I mean, I was never a fast cuber. I stayed around, basically organizing events, organizing the U.S. National Championships, the World Championships in 2013. So by the time we got to 2013, it had been enough time. It was nearly 10 years of working on this stuff. I was getting married that year, and the WCA and just cubing stuff was taking me a lot of time.
Right.
At that point, I kind of felt, okay, it's probably time to move on to another phase of life.
Right. Yeah. Well, I know, like, and so do many of our viewers. I've been, pretty into, what's been going on as of lately. But I think for this week, we're gonna pretty much like travel back in time. Instead of doing like a week in cubing, we'll be doing a week in cubing from
Yeah.
a couple decades ago.
I'm not as familiar with what's been going on, going on up to date, right?
Right. But I think people would be curious as to kind of, I guess, understand, where the roots of the WCA came from, what was popular and stuff, whether it was cubing hardware, famous
Cubing hardware?
cubers. Well,
You make it sound like we had a choice.
That's true. See, back then, you
Yeah.
guys only had like type A's and stuff, like DIY kits?
No, Rubik's brand.
Was that it?
The DIY kits didn't come until later.
Really?
Okay.
Wow. So even that's even further back than I thought it was. Wow. Okay.
So I learned to solve the cube on, I believe it was July 24th, 2003.
Okay.
My brother, he had to leave, unfortunately, but he went to a summer camp and he had learned to solve the cube there. He told me over AOL Instant Messenger.
Wow.
And so I told him, hey, when I'm home, you got to teach me how to do this. So he taught me over the course of 2 hours. And after working on this for about a couple hours, I could solve the cube in 10 minutes with a sheet of notes.
Okay.
Right. And I think what makes the cube really addictive is you get really fast really quickly, especially in the early days. You're from 10 minutes down to 5.
Right.
And then you're down to 2 minutes, right? It's just so fast.
Right.
Obviously, that tapers off.
Right.
But in the beginning, it's really addictive for that reason. And so we kept getting better, right? I think I want to say I got to about maybe a minute, about 60 seconds, right? And then we found a method on lar5.com, Lars Petrus's method. So I switched over to that, got down to 45 seconds, and then eventually, moved over to Jessica Friedrich's website to learn this F2L idea.
Right.
So this was all July of 2003. In August of 2003, they held the first World Championships since the 1982 World Championships.
Right.
And that was held in Toronto. But I had just learned about cubing, so I wasn't plugged into the community. I didn't go to Toronto. I didn't hear about it in time. I easily would have gone had I known, but I just didn't hear about it in time. So then we're in 2003. I go back to school. I'm a sophomore at Caltech. I'm cubing along. At this point, I've learned this F2L idea, so I'm down to like mid to upper 20s, right?
Right.
Maybe even yeah, maybe like call it 23, 24 seconds.
And was that like pretty much like as fast as you could get because the hardware was limiting, or was there still room to
No,
improve?
I was going to improve.
Okay.
I would get to sub 20 in September of I think 2004.
Okay.
Right, so I still had some improvement to go. And then I would say 2004, 2005 I was probably in the 17s. So
Okay.
but on speedcubing.com they had a list of these unofficial times, right? So number one was the name was Thomas Templier, some guy from France,
Right.
15.15. And the second place time, I think it was like 15.3 or something, was this guy, Shitaro Makisumi. So he had a link to his website, which was cubefreak.com. I go to this website, and he's got a bunch of information. It's all Japanese color scheme cube.
Right.
And there's a video of him juggling. So I click on the video, and there's I think Mackie must have been 12 or 13, and probably 12 in that video.
Oh, wow.
He's juggling 7 balls.
Wow.
But he's juggling these balls in front of at a 24-hour fitness in Pasadena.
Oh.
So I realized, wait, this guy, this kid, he doesn't live in Japan. He actually lives close to me.
Right.
So I sent him an email. I'm like, hey, can I meet you? I'd be curious to see someone solve a cube in 15 seconds.
Right. Right.
I can't even imagine this being possible. So I went and found him at math practice. He solved the cube. For me, and I was like, he solved my cube, right?
Right.
Different color scheme. It took 17 seconds, and my thought there was like, well, I kind of don't want to wait 21 years for another World Championships, right?
Right. Right.
Why don't we just host our own local event? And the beauty of this is that like we got Mackie, we can get this kid. He's like the fastest. He's one of the fastest people in the world, if not the fastest person.
Right.
If he comes to our event, we're legit.
Right.
So that's how I got the idea. Like, hey, let's just host more of these competitions. The Speed Stacks timer, the Gen 1 Speed Stack timer back then was $100.
Really.
So I bought 2 of them. We gave one of them to as like the winning prize.
Right. Right.
Because they were really inaccessible back then, and we knew that Mackie was going to end up with the timer, right? But
Right.
So yeah, that's how we got started, basically.
Wow. Yeah, that's to me, if I had to picture how it started, it was would have been like oh, I'm gonna reach out to Rubik's or something and ask for help to organize this like official event, and maybe there was some sort of press even if it was small, but like to me it seemed like and I've never done my own like deep dive into the history of the WCA, but to me it was like I'm gonna ask for help from this established brand, we'll get something going, and then from there I'll be like, okay, I'll make my own organization. And then
right. So a couple of things happened from here, right? So
Right.
I think in January for that first one, I was using my school email account, so I don't have these emails anymore. I must have reached out to Dan Gosby, who was the organizer of the Toronto World Championships in
Right.
2003. He said something about like, oh, you have to use certain scrambles to make sure that they're hard enough, and I didn't really understand it. So I'm like, why would one scramble be harder than another?
right.
At the time, I didn't understand it. I think Lars Petrus kind of explained it to me later. The reason why they had specific scrambles was that they were making sure that you wouldn't get too many pieces in the cross.
Right.
Lars thought this was ridiculous because he didn't make a cross and he was color neutral.
Right.
And this is at a time where very few people were color neutral.
Right.
And of course, it doesn't take much thinking to realize that there's a very easy way to game this system by just saying, oh, I'm a red cross solver.
Right.
I mean, well, today it doesn't matter because everyone's color neutral now.
Right.
So I must have reached out to Dan Gosby about certain, just trying to see how we could follow in his footsteps. I remember we held another competition in April so the first one was January 24th, I think, of 2004, and we held another one in April of 2004, and that's when I reached out to Rubik and Guinness.
Okay. And did these competitions just have 3x3, or was there anything else? Or
The first one definitely only had 3x3. And so one thing to keep in mind here was when we first started holding competitions, we weren't good at it. The
Right.
number of solves per timer per hour was really low. So you could only really do.
And how many people were at these like
The
competitions?
first one was like 26, and the second one may have been like 40.
Oh, so still relatively decent size. I mean, nowadays, 20 to 40 would be like considered like a smaller comp. But I imagine, back then, that was huge for what would be
It wasn't huge because we had no standard. But we couldn't have hosted more people. To give you an idea of like what happened in the first competition, right? We'd call someone up to the timer. They'd give me their cube. I would take the cube and I would go scramble it myself. There was no concept of a scrambler,
right,
or there was no concept of a runner. Those things happened later.
right,
Anyway, so I reached out to Guinness, and it became really clear to me that like Guinness was not going to be an authority on this. Guinness, first of all, they required that we have like someone supervising, and so I got my astrophysics advisor to like supervise. I'm like, what's the point of this? She doesn't know anything.
right,
I'm very thankful she spent the time. Dr. Lynn Hillenbrand. The other thing was that they said, well, you have to use cubes out of the box. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, how is this fair?
right,
The cubes that come out of the box vary widely in quality, right? Like,
right,
you could get screwed just by having a bad cube out of the box.
right. And does that mean you would have to buy new cubes for every competition
No,
following that standard?
we never got. I never asked that question because the first one was already ridiculous.
Right, right,
Right. And so I think these types of requirements from Guinness made it really clear, like, these people don't care about the details of what you're doing.
right,
They're just trying to get some stats in there. They're pretending to be authorities so that they can publish it in their book.
right,
And so, and I think this is probably on some archive somewhere. I think someone sent me the link to it, but I think I wrote an email saying, "Hey, look, Guinness is not Guinness doesn't have to be the authority here.
right,
We do this ourselves. We set our terms. We make the standard. We get this going. We expand this. Guinness will have to take our times."
right. And especially
Right.
since you guys would be more knowledgeable on the subject, than they would be. You guys would be, relatively like knowledgeable people. You would understand it a lot better than they would.
That being said, of course, at this time, Guinness has no idea who's who.
Right.
They don't know that we're knowledgeable, right? It's from my standpoint, I'm like, I've spent a lot of time solving this thing. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. You're telling me things that don't make sense, and you're saying it with certainty.
Right,
And so that tells me you haven't thought about this at all.
right,
So really, I think if there's a lesson here, it's, you can't really take the world as it is sometimes. You have to ask the question of like, why should Guinness be the authority on this, right? Because clearly, like they can't be experts on every single thing they publish,
right,
right? And I mean, if anyone, a lot of people go out and get random Guinness records just
right.
for
Just to say that they
just to have one.
Right,
so I think that was probably one of the big lessons there is like, just ignore Guinness, right? We can be the one to set the standard. We can make Guinness follow us.
Right.
That was that was a nice revelation.
yeah. So, kind of sticking to that subject, like, did at some point Guinness start like respecting like the records that like you would post on the WCA and be like, this person got a world record?
They did.
And so they did eventually come around to being like, okay, you guys
It was
understand you have this like way of verifying this.
It was a transition, right? Where Guinness would publish records every year,
Right.
right? And so there was a transition where at one point I think Leon's 11.13 was in the book, and we were like, all right, finally they're listening to us.
Right.
But then they would also have just some other non-WCA record in there that was like, oh, the world record for solving the most number of cubes in 24 hours is like 300. And we're like, do you not do any thinking here? Like, what's 24 hours divided by 11 seconds, right?
Right.
Well, let's say Leon's not even 11 seconds. Let's make him a minute. And let's say he has to go take a piss and go eat and grab coffee. Like, clearly this
Right.
is stupid, right?
Right.
And so there was a transition where they had some of our records and some of these records where it just clearly didn't make sense.
Right.
Clearly today, everyone's going to look at the WCA as the authority on who
Right.
holds records.
Because I mean, after 20 years, it's very much solidified its place as being this very official organization. We have rules, we have regulations, we have ways of verifying certain things.
I think by the time, I would be curious to go back and look at the Guinness Book of World Records, right, and kind of see
Right.
when do we stop seeing these non-WCA records. My guess is probably around 2008, 2009.
Okay.
When the WCA was fully entrenched as the single authority on Rubik's Cube and related puzzles.
Right. So, kind of on topic, kind of off topic, but there has been discussion of people wanting to do, making another organization or doing like leagues and stuff. But I'm more interested in, you know, because starting that kind of thing would be, at least I feel like today would be quite the investment and quite expensive to, try and match the level the WCA is at. So I'm more curious, how did you, start the WCA? Like, how did you come up with, people to staff, regulations and stuff? Like, what was that process?
Okay, so we had the first competition in January of 2004. We had a second competition in April of 2004. There were no regulations written at that time.
Right.
We had the basic ideas of 15-second inspection. If you popped a piece out, you could get another solve. Which
And so the 15 seconds of inspection, was that like your idea, or was that like something that like Rubik's or Guinness had said?
we borrowed it from 2003 Toronto.
Okay.
But it was Toronto also borrowed it from 1982 Budapest.
Okay.
So 1982, the timer they used was different. It was a light sensor timer.
Okay.
But they gave the competitors 15 seconds to inspect.
Okay, so it was pretty much established.
It is a relic from
the start.
1982.
Okay.
So yeah, these were things we just inherited, right? The whole average of 5 dropping the fast and slows that we borrowed from 2003, right? Because 1982 was best of 3, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, 2004, we were hosting the U.S. Championships at Caltech because I was a student there, so I could get space. And I remember, so the previous summer in 2003, I was working as a counselor at this summer program called EPGY. It's now called the Stanford Summer Institutes. I was a counselor there, and that's where I first learned to solve the cube. Because I was close to home, so when I could, Toby was able to teach me. So then the next year in 2004, I'm working at this camp again, and I remember sitting. I sat on the couch like over the weekends, or when the kids were just when I could just like hang out and not do much.
Right.
I sat on the couch and basically wrote out like the first draft of the regulations.
Okay.
Because I knew we needed something for this U.S. National Championships.
Right. And was there something that you wrote that would be like considered today maybe like controversial or like a dumb idea that you eventually like took out?
That's a good question. I mean, there were things that I borrowed that I think we don't do today, right? Like extra solves for pops.
Right.
But cubes don't pop today.
Right. Like the majority of them don't, because, cubing hardware has gotten better.
Cubing hardware has gotten so much better, right?
Right.
I'm sure there is stuff, I just can't think of it, right? I think there are probably some things that carry forward today. I wouldn't say it's dumb, right? Like the scramble orientation is white on top, green on front, right? Now you have to pick something to standardize it.
Right.
That was just my blindfold color scheme.
Okay.
See,
so you just went like, this is something I already do. I'm just making this the guideline.
I mean, I felt like white should be on top.
Is that just because like that's where the logo was? Like, all the time?
And it's white. Like white's like different than the other 5. The other 5 are colors. White's not really a color, right?
Right.
Right. Now you got to pick something for front. So okay, well, I'm in charge. I get to pick it.
Right. The benefits of being in charge.
Right. So that's a relic today, right? That's and I gave Lee and Lo a bunch of crap about it because I think his blindfold color scheme was it's either yellow and blue or yellow. It was different than mine. So like we couldn't really talk about cubing stuff or blindfolds. It made it hard to talk about. Oh, his numbering scheme was different too.
Oh, really? Okay.
Back then we used numbers. Now you use
we use letters now. Yeah.
So so the first draft of regulations was written for the U.S. National Championships.
Okay.
In 2004, I believe that was won by John Morris.
Okay.
His average may have been like 16.53 or something.
Yeah. So, like that's also interesting. It's just thinking about like, because today, I average like 8-9 seconds, and so like then hearing records, from well before I even started cubing.
Well, if you watched me solve a cube, you would be surprised. Because I move the cube differently than you would move the cube.
Were you still using like wrist turns predominantly then?
Wrist turns is more of a kind of that's like Dan Knight's and like Friedrich era and Lars.
Okay.
By the time we got to, we were doing finger turns, but we kept our fingers straight.
Okay.
Because you needed the leverage to actually turn U or U prime. So yeah, there's stuff like that. Like I think now like it's a much finer touch on these fingers that people are
right? And hardware was much different then, and that was probably, you know,
Right.
a limitation.
There was no choice in hardware. We would all buy the standard Rubik's branded cubes, and then you would have to work them to get them as good as
Right.
possible.
And what was like, because I'm sure there was some sort of modification process to
It
that
was mostly greasing the cube, but having a good cube versus a bad cube, that there was the cubes were not nearly as consistent. So what I would do, we would go buy these cubes from the local toy store. It was like 685 or something. It was, we would buy boxes of these things.
right.
Leon got really good at opening up these boxes. It was like this plastic hexagonal packaging. He got really good at opening it from the bottom. I wasn't as good. I cut myself a couple of times. We would pick out the good ones, and then we'd sell the rest of the competitions.
Oh, okay.
Because and that's how we funded a lot of the early competitions. We would buy all these cubes wholesale and just sell them at the competitions.
Right. Okay.
Without a wholesale license,
Yeah. I mean, it was a different time then.
yeah, different time. But yeah. So
Yeah, that's so like. So when did at what point did you like kind of like think to yourself like I've made an organization that's like that's going to be successful at, like, what point did you kind of come to that conclusion?
I mean, I would say I came to that conclusion pretty early, but I would also say what I thought of as success is not what you would consider success today, right?
Okay.
In a sense, we got the WCA set up. We had competitions following regulations around the world. It was spreading. That was a success.
Yeah.
We had Guinness starting to respect our records. Yeah, that's all we kind of
Okay.
needed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy to me. And I kind of along the topic of starting either a new organization or doing leagues or doing like some sort of branching out, like, do you think, just like, quick opinion, like, do you think that would be like a feasible idea? Like, do you think someone today could do that, relatively easily? Like, of course it won't be easy, but like,
Something could always be done, I think, right? I think what you do, if someone wants to do something else or something ancillary or something, whatever it is,
right.
I think there's probably two main things to think about. I think the first one is just how does this fit in as to the market and as a product? Like, is this something that makes sense?
Right.
Are you providing value to your customers, right? And I think the second part is the execution, right? The execution is going to be dependent on, are you rolling this out in a way that makes sense? Can you roll it out in a way that maintains trust with the community while simultaneously having alignment with partners that are along for the ride? That second one takes maturity and perspective.
Right.
And so I think that's probably one of the things I think about when I look back 20 years ago, right? I was 19 years old when the WCA was started, right? And so from that standpoint, right, there's a lot that I didn't know. Now we got things going. Things got going. Things worked, right? The WCA spread. From that standpoint, it was successful.
Right.
But I would approach things very, very differently if I were to do it today. And it's 20 years later. I've gone through college. I've had jobs. I've served
Right.
on nonprofit boards. I run a company now, right? I got married. I got kids. Right?
Right.
It's just I'm an adult now,
Right.
right? And I think this is just one of the things I think perhaps that people I think this is true for everyone, right? Like, there is a difference between being an adult and being a kid, and there's a difference between being an adult that has experience in these components I've talked about: marketing, partnerships, operations, execution, governance, right? These are all skills that people need to learn.
Right.
And there's a big difference in adults who know these things versus those that don't.
Right.
I'm currently the president of the board of the California Youth Symphony right now, right? And it's something that we think very carefully about when we are trying to find board members, right? Because I don't really just want dead weight, nor do I want someone who's doing something dumb, right? And then now I have to
Right.
like come in and now I have to come in and fight you about it. Like, I don't really want to
Right.
spend time on that, right? Like, I'm not saying I need you to agree, but I need you to make sense.
Right.
And I think people don't place enough value on this idea. Making sense is actually a very complex thing.
Right.
And so that's why, at least, I feel I've been lucky over, the course of the jobs I've had, my career progression, the different opportunities that I've had, right?
Right.
And just the different life lessons learned along the way that, yeah, 20 years later, I'm a very different person than I was when I was a 19-year-old
Right.
kid. You know, unfortunately, I think a lot of people who get this experience that would be very valuable to running these organizations don't necessarily have the time to put into these
Right.
organizations, and that's the catch-22.
Yeah. So I know, the WCA as of right now, they're always, at least for the last few years, and maybe even, was something you had thought of at one point, but, they want to become like a recognized sports organization. Do you think it would be beneficial to create leagues for those, even if it's just for like, the world class solvers to, maybe be able to help organize sponsorships a bit more from even like brands that aren't related to speed cubing?
So, right now, I'm the co-founder and CEO of a startup. We announced our Series A funding in June. I guess where I'm going at this is along the startup journey of when you start a tech startup, right? I think one of the biggest lessons, and this was really hammered into us by our seed round investors, Unusual Ventures. One of the big lessons that I think we learned, or that was really hammered into us, is that there are steps along the way, things that you need to do to be successful, right? As an example, if I'm building a product, you can't just sell that product immediately. You can't just go try to close a bunch of contracts.
Right.
You need to figure out, who are you selling to? Are you solving their pain? And how are you going to communicate this? There are things that you need to do before you can go do the things that you want to do,
Right.
right? And so I think in terms of making the WCA successful and this idea about a sport, I'm going to ignore the question of whether or not being a sport matters or whether or not it makes sense.
Okay.
If you want a bigger presence for the WCA, the biggest thing is probably going to be that the organization needs to grow up. You need people who have more experience running things. And again, right, the people who have the time to volunteer aren't necessarily the people who have this type of experience. And
Right.
by the time you get that experience, you kind of don't have the time. And look, this is not so much, to be clear, I'm not commenting on any of the current situation.
Right. Right.
I think back to, this must have been, 2012, 2013, 2014. I can't remember. There's a Swedish cuber named Anders Larsson.
Okay.
He unfortunately passed away. There was a hiking accident, so I miss him dearly. But I remember back then, Ron and I were running things, right? And Lars was kind of this independent investigation. He was helping us like with independent investigations and things like that. But he was kind of like the adult advisor in the room, right? And one of the things I remember he was telling me was, you have to decide, what is the WCA, right? Are you an organization? What do you care about as an organization, right? And there are these fundamental questions I think need to be asked. And you have to think about these different components, right? Like, what do you care about? Where do you fit in the market? What's the product? Who are you serving? How are you going to execute it? How are you going to execute? What is your governance? I think these are the base things that really need to be answered, rather than, hey, we should be a sport. That's going to be cool, right? That's right. And that's where I tie it to my example of like a startup, right? You don't just go, hey, let's go build this awesome thing. Let's go build this website. Everyone wants Uber for dogs, right? Everyone's gonna want that. This thing's you can't do that, right? If you want to build Uber for dogs, great. Okay, let's talk about it. What's the market size of this? Are there ways we can validate this before we spend a whole bunch of time working on this thing?
Right.
So yeah, I think that's how I would think about things.
So essentially, just kind of like the WCA where it is now. Like if we wanted to progress into being a sport, we would need to think about some like certain like factors and stuff.
There's a whole bunch of questions I would ask before asking that
Right.
question, right? And it is like, what do you care about? Who are you trying to serve? What's the purpose of, why do you want to be a sport?
Right.
Right? and does that match with everything else that you're doing? Those are the questions that I
Right.
think need to be answered.
Okay. And then
And maybe the answer is yes, right?
right.
But not having been in on these types of discussions, I don't know if these questions have been answered.
Right. So just in, I guess, with what you already know, like, do you think that having the WCA be a recognized sports organization would be a good thing? Because a lot of people say, once recognized, there's a higher possibility of, these outside investors, we can get like groups like Red Bull and stuff to help sponsor and fund these things. And maybe hardware gets better. It's not necessarily cubing hardware, but, timing hardware, or even like we could start, paying people to actually be staff. Like, do you think, like, just with what you know?
Sure. So I'll go back 5 years ago, which for me doesn't feel like that long ago, but it's like
Right.
what, 25% of your life.
Right.
I was in London. I was working at Google, and I was in London, and I decided to pay a visit to Seven Towns. This was 2019 October. I went by Seven Towns, and I had lunch with Chrissy Trussell. And we were just chatting, right? I mean, by this time, I'm 6 years removed from the WCA.
Right.
And the thing that she told me about was that the WCA was a volunteer. It's people don't get paid. It's a volunteer organization. It's grassroots.
Right.
From her standpoint, and this I totally get it today. Now, having as a CEO of a company, I completely get it now. It's very difficult to negotiate, or not just negotiate. It's very difficult to plan with something that is volunteer based, right? As a company, if from Seven Town's standpoint, when they used to own the brand, like you can't expect anyone to put seven figures of money behind something without a plan that makes sense.
Right.
They need to be confident in the plan, the execution of the plan. Things need to move fast enough for it to be relevant, right? You just have to have confidence. If I'm going to put $1 million behind something, I have to be confident that I'm going to get the value out of this.
Right.
I think this is difficult with a volunteer organization.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So,
So sorry, does that answer the question about so sports, right? Like
right.
you can go to me, it's not about being a sport or not a sport. I think it's, can you be an organization that can stand up with the maturity as the people who you're trying to partner with, right?
Right. Okay.
That's right. Like,
yeah.
Look, as much as I might like you, right? Like, I can't give $1 million to a bunch of 17-year-olds.
Right. So essentially, it's less.
And I'm not saying that WCA is a bunch of 17-year-olds.
Right. Right.
Saying it's a confidence, right?
Right.
And don't get me wrong. I'm sure the WCA has done fine in terms of the partnership. But to me, right, like if you want to elevate yourself to the next level, it's about organizational maturity, I think.
Right. So I guess it's less of, do you think it should, or would it be beneficial? I guess it's more of like where we are now, like are we at that level to ask that question?
You can pursue all these things that you want, right? You can go try to be a sport. You can try to go get these sponsorships. You can do all of that. I think if you focus on the fundamental work of being a well-functioning organization, I think you'll get 10 times as much.
Okay.
Right. And so I think, and this is one of the traps that I think people fall into, right? You look at the WCA, by all means, I'm sure is very successful. So they're getting sponsorships, they're getting things, right?
Right.
And from that standpoint, you can look at the output and say, okay, this is successful, right? But that's not necessarily asking the question, are we doing everything that we can, or what are the things that we can solve?
Okay.
So if I look at this back at, for myself, as a 19-year-old, back in 2004, it would have been very difficult for Seven Towns to negotiate with me. I'm 19 years old. I'm a college kid. I'm studying astrophysics. And I don't even know anything about astrophysics, right? How do you expect me as a 19-year-old to respect the priorities of a multi-million-dollar organization that's running one of the most recognizable brands in the world?
Right.
Right? Because here I am, like, getting all like fussy about like little minor regulations here or there, right? Like there's a broader picture, and if if we can if we can empathize with each other about like what our needs are, then you're a lot more. It's a lot easier to come up to it's a lot easier to come and find common ground.
Right.
And now, if you can trust me, right now we have a better chance of getting business done.
Okay. Yeah. So, kind of branching away from should we be a sport, but still kind of sticking to that kind of sports organization-ish theme. Like, were you still relatively active when Red Bull started doing like their?
No, that's like 2017,
Okay,
right?
so-
oh, I'm
But
I have a kid at this point.
but are you like? Do you like know what it was like?
It was like a head-to-head type thing where they got cubers out, and it was like they
Yeah.
televised it. They put a ton of production value into it, I think.
So do you like? My question would be like, do you think that's beneficial to the cubing community? Like, if we were to have more of those, not necessarily just the WCA, but to the community as a whole, do you think that would be like, more beneficial to have like more stuff like that? Because with their money, they're able to put more,
Sure.
like you said, production value into it, which brings more awareness to it. But even now, we've started, like we are like our next competition that we're hosting, is going to be streamed. It's going to be live streamed. That's happening more and more with competitions now, especially here on the West Coast. Like we have Cubers Live and stuff, but Happy Feet Productions, they're streaming competitions. There's people watching it and stuff, and I think we're starting to expand out into these, non-cubers and bringing more people in.
I think all of this is good. Okay, so I think these are two different things, right? So these streaming things that you're doing is really to enthusiasts. Right? You're probably not going to reach.
Yeah, they're primarily for
Right.
people already like really into it.
So things like Red Bull, though, that has the capacity to reach
Right.
the broader market. So it's again, what do you care about, right? I don't want to put words in your mouth, right? If I'm SpeedCubeShop, right, like, who do I care about more? Well, the average person, the average non-cuber might buy 1 cube, and the average cuber is going to buy 100, right? So and if I have to ask this, you have to ask this question as a WCA as well, or anyone, right?
Right.
Who do you care about? Are you serving the cubing community, or are you trying to broaden your reach, right? It doesn't mean that you can't do both, but whatever initiative you do needs to
Right.
make sense for both. I will say, I'll give an example of something that I think has like kind of broad reach, right? The Nathan's hot dog eating contest,
Yeah.
right? Every July 4th, right?
Yeah.
Now there's an entire league. There's this entire major league eating league where people go and eat ridiculous amounts of stuff, right? And you probably don't watch any of those, right?
Right.
But you know the Nathan's
Yeah,
hot
right.
dog contest, so you can already see how these two things. I'm not saying they can't feed each other, right? But is it a reasonable I don't know how reasonable that expectation is.
Okay.
But Nathan's hot dog because it happens every year.
Right.
If it happened once and then didn't happen again, you probably wouldn't know about it.
Right. Yeah. Because I know for me personally, I think, like not necessarily specifically, the Red Bull, thing happening, but I think it would be interesting to see these other companies host these things, especially for these more top level cubers to bring more awareness to it. Because I think when you bring in outside companies, it's probably more for the people who aren't into it. It's more that entertainment value. You turn it on, you watch it, and especially if it's a yearly thing, like that's something you can look forward
Sure.
to. And it might be like, oh well, is there more of this happening? They look into it, they see the WCA, they find
Absolutely, right? There's definitely a trickle down effect, right?
Right.
If you can reach a mass audience, you're going to just get more of that, right?
right.
So certainly, yeah, absolutely agree there.
Yeah, dude, I just like I'm trying to think of more things to like pick your brain about, because but it's kind of hard because like when I started cubing, that was like I learned to solve in 2014, really got into it 2016, and by that point you were already kind of like out
Yeah.
of it. So it's like there's a little bit of a gap there that we're trying to, connect through, but. I guess
I think 2013, 2014 is probably around the time when Cubing USA as an entity, when they started putting efforts into making a
Right.
formal nonprofit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll kind of stray away a little bit from the WCA stuff and more ask a little bit more personal stuff in the sense of like by the time you were kind of quote unquote out of it, what was like your main cue? Like what were you using then? If you can remember. It's been a while.
I think it was this Danchi that came in the purple box,
Right,
right? You had
okay.
the Guhong and the
Yeah. There was the Panchi too that came out like I think a year later after
yeah,
the
but there's this
Sanchi.
Janchi that came in a purple box and
Yeah.
it's really good.
Yeah, okay. So for those of you who don't
For everyone who doesn't know,
right. The Zanchi, I mean, that was I from what I remember was like a pretty good like go-to cube at the time. A lot of people really liked it. If I'm not mistaken.
no, yeah, it
Yeah.
was popular.
Yeah, I mean there weren't too many options then,
Yeah.
I would say I guess this would be a good question to ask. When did, brands like Moyu, Gan, all these other companies start to really
I don't
show up?
I don't remember. Like the last thing in my head is basically the Guhong.
Okay.
Guhong Zanchi, those are the last names in my head.
Okay, wow. Okay. And then I guess what's your fastest solve? Your PB single.
1243. Did it recently.
Okay.
I want to say probably within the last year.
And is that on older hardware or newer hardware?
Versus newer hardware.
Okay, I'm just
But
curious.
my previous PB to that was 12.75. I want to say it's Armonk in like 2008.
Okay, okay.
15.60 second average at Denver Open 2008.
Okay.
Well, the funny thing about the 2000 that Denver Open, when I ended up winning that competition,
Really?
I beat Frank Morris, who used to hold the world record for 5x5, and he was a big cube guy. But after I won this competition, Stefan Pochman, he did a whole bunch of data science to show that if Tyson Mao won a competition, and this was one of the easiest competitions around,
Right.
so he had like mathematically proven that I suck. I was fine with that.
Yeah. So I guess Cameron would probably want me to ask this, but he might also already know the answer. But like, when you were still, pretty much in charge, was Magic like an event that you guys did?
Well, yeah, I think I was the one to get rid of Magic.
Really?
Well, you couldn't judge the thing.
Cameron would not like that.
Because every time, like, because you're flipping these panels, right?
Right.
And the last flip kind of coincides with when you stop the timer. So
Right.
it's like,
Yeah.
were you touching the timer when you stopped? I'm like, I can't tell.
Right. Yeah. I know Cameron loves Magic. We usually host that as like a bonus event at our competition.
Nice.
So, but yeah, did I assume you would have competed in Magic?
No.
No, really?
So I was a very limited cuber. I spent almost all my time on the administrative side. So
Really? Okay.
I solved 3x3 speed, not well, but I did blindfold, and I was world class in blindfold for some time. But in 2007, at the World Championships in Hungary, in Budapest, they were running behind because they had volunteers trying to scramble 4x4s. It was a disaster, right?
And did you have to like, what was it a rule that like if it was misscrambled you had to?
Well, they were trying to do their best to be,
Right.
they were trying to do their best to be legitimate. And I remember someone had messed up on the scramble. And Kolosh Kantor was one of the organizers, I think. So he hands me this 4x4 to solve, and I'm like, I don't actually know the parity algorithm for orientation parity. And he looks at me, he's like, telling me that the founder of the WCA can't solve a 4x4. I'm like, that is exactly what I'm telling you. I spent all my time being an administrator. Like,
Wow. So what exactly were the events then that you would do? Was it just,
compete in?
Yeah.
Well, I just do speed solve and blindfold.
Really? Okay.
I mean, I'm for some of the smaller ones, I may have entered one-handed or 2x2 or 4x4, but I'm comically bad at them.
Okay. Okay. So not very big on the competing side of things. So really just kind of sticking predominantly with the administration side and just being a behind the scenes kind of.
Yeah, and I think that made me a really good administrator, right? Because I had nothing to gain, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, I couldn't even cheat and win.
Yeah.
Well, I couldn't cheat in a way that would be plausible and win. Like, if you gave me a scramble ahead of time, and if you even let me like reverse scramble into a set of moves, it would take me probably 6 to 7 seconds to solve the cube, and I'd have to skip so much that it would look fake.
Yeah.
If you gave me a cube, a pre-scramble, and you let me practice it a whole bunch, maybe I get to 11.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Interesting. I'm trying to think of more stuff like. Okay.
So yeah, I think having people, right, who are willing to run the organization that don't have really anything to gain from it, I think that's important, right?
Right. Not necessarily people who don't compete, but like put more time into the administration aspect of it.
Well, you should want to do things for the good of the organization. And that's a key part of any nonprofit. I think there are a couple challenges here, right? One is like, yeah, sometimes people they want glory on the cubing stage, right?
And you think that might kind of like that like desire and need for that, you think could impact their decision making for
I'll give an example. Yeah, I'll, you know, you can go figure out what this is. I won't name the guy. He doesn't like me, so I don't really care, right? But like, yeah, like I never felt like 3x3. Sorry, I never felt like 3x3 blindfolded. I never felt like we should measure averages.
Okay.
Because like the average is not what you're doing. It's not a goal in the competition. It's an artifact of having to of just getting 3 solves. But people don't get ranked based off. People don't win based off of the 3x3 blindfold average. So it's like something that you just kind of coincidentally get, right? It's not something. It is a misalignment. That record is a misalignment with the objectives of the competition.
Right.
Right. Whereas like 3x3, like single versus average. Well, to get a fast average, right, you need good singles so that it's a little bit more aligned, right? But like for 3x3 blindfold, right, if I get a good first solve, I should kind of take more risks, you know.
Right.
So anyway.
So
Right?
so the idea kind of is like, you know, I should be essentially going like all out, you know, and I should be getting rewarded for that. Whereas if I, you know, safety everything.
Well, the point is, I simply felt there was a misalignment between the 3x3 blindfold average as a record and what the objectives were in the competition.
Okay.
And look, cubing's different today. People are a lot better at blindfold,
Right.
but I'm sure success rate's a lot better now. But right, so because there's a misalignment, I didn't really feel like we should be measuring this as an average, right? Or sorry, as a record.
Right.
But you know, the person who did it, like I kind of felt like he did it because he wanted his own world record.
Right. Okay.
Right. So that's the decision, right? Like, I mean, in a sense, like you should not be making this decision because you should recuse yourself from this decision.
Right.
Right. Because you can't be unbiased.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Right. So that's one side of like one thing to kind of look out for, right? And the second thing is like for administrative glory, right? And this is. I've found this with a number of nonprofits that I've worked with. You have people who like do these nonprofits and they get on the board and like they're proud of this. I mean, not that they're proud of it, but they have an ego, right? This is like the most important thing in their life and the most important part of their identity.
Right.
And now you kind of like showing off a little bit.
Right.
And that's a problem too.
Okay, interesting.
So
So there is a balance to have.
I've always said the best person to run these types of organizations is the person who doesn't want to do it.
Yeah.
You have nothing. Yeah.
Right. There's nothing to gain from it.
There's nothing to gain.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So for those watching, take those thoughts, you know, apply them to current issues, controversies, and stuff.
Oh, I mean, I wasn't going to go that far. I'm speaking from personal
Well, yeah,
experience.
but I'm just saying, you know, I guess keep that in the back of your mind when you're, you know, thinking about certain things that happen, certain decisions that get made, you know.
Sure.
You know.
I mean, I think this is true just for any volunteer-based organization, right?
Right.
Like, simply said, like parents in a PTA, right? Like,
Right.
right? Like, you got that one parent who's like, this is their identity. They're really proud of it. They
Right.
you know they like ordering people around, and that's not fun for anyone, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, we've been at this for nearly 50 minutes. I think we've covered quite a bit.
yeah.
And it's been great being able to, you know, pick your brain for some of this stuff. And, you know, maybe when this video comes out, if you're willing, you could always look at the comments. I'm sure there will be more questions that people will ask.
We'll see. Yeah. I mean, I know there's a lot going on in the world, in the cubing world right now.
Right.
I want to be clear that what I'm saying right now is I would make these comments independent of the situation today, right? This is just what I've learned.
And this is based off your experience that, you know, that you've had before you left, you know, like this is, you know,
and experiences after I've left too, but with different organizations.
Right, exactly.
I've dealt with nonprofits where I had to deal with people who had egos. I'm like, why are you really on this board? Like, you don't seem to be making decisions in the best interest of this organization.
Right, exactly. So these like opinions and statements and stuff are not, you know, they're not based on certain things that have happened recently. They're based...
I would make the same comments today if we had this conversation 2 months ago.
Right. Right. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. So awesome. Great to have you on. I
Yeah.
think Cameron wants to, at some point,
Oh,
pick your brain for other stuff.
Vegas
so-
isn't too far. I'm here every now and then for whatever. So next time I'm in town, it'd be great to drop by again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed. This has been great, an amazing opportunity to have. I hope you enjoyed.
I mean, I enjoy thinking about this stuff because it's relevant in everything in a lot of things, right?
Right.
It's relevant in the cubing world. It's relevant for my job. It's relevant for the volunteering, the other organizations I'm with. It's relevant for how I think about just what it means to go through this crazy world.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like and subscribe. There's always more of these coming out pretty much every week. And maybe we'll see Tyson once again, maybe next week, maybe sometime in the future. But yeah, this has been great.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
All right. Take care.